All right, get ready because today we're taking a deep dive into some seriously cool research you sent over. It's all about how we train those massive language models everyone's buzzing about, LLMs. You're curious about something called floating point quantization training. And you even sent over this paper titled Scaling Laws for Floating Point Quantization Training. I gotta admit, it's a mouthful. But the findings seem pretty mind-blowing. Like, could there actually be such a thing as 2 SCH data when you're training one of these LLMs? Well, luckily, I've got an expert with us today who can break it all down. I'm already hooked, so let's just jump right in. What's the deal with this floating point quantization training? Why do we even need a whole new scaling law for it?
Well, it's really all about efficiency. We're basically looking for ways to train these huge LLMs without needing a supercomputer the size of a small planet. And that's where floating point quantization comes into play. The idea is to use fewer bits to represent the numbers involved in the training process. Now, you're probably thinking, hold on, won't that make the model less accurate? And you'd be right to think that. But here's the thing. There's this sweet spot, a balance we can find between keeping things precise and making the whole process way more efficient.
Okay, so we're being smart about how we use our computing resources. But why do we need a new scaling law specifically for floating point numbers? What's so special about them?
That's a great question. See, most of the earlier research was focused on a simpler type of quantization that used integers. Those are whole numbers. But with LLMs, we really need the flexibility of floating point numbers. They can represent a much wider range of values like fractions and decimals. It's like the difference between having a basic toolbox and a full-blown workshop. The problem is those old scaling laws, they didn't really take into account how floating point numbers actually work, especially when you start using fewer bits. So they ended up giving some pretty wonky predictions. This new research, it tackles that issue head on.
So they basically had to rewrite the rule book for this floating point quantization thing, huh? And did it actually work? Did they find a new scaling law that actually gives accurate predictions?
They did. They ran hundreds of experiments. They were super meticulous about it. They tweaked all these different factors, like the size of the model, how much data they were using to train it, and of course the precision level, how many bits they were using for those floating point numbers. And get this, they discovered a brand new equation. It's a much more accurate one that can actually predict how well an LLM will perform under all these different low precision settings. This is huge for researchers who are trying to optimize their whole training process, get the best results without wasting a ton of resources.
So it's like a cheat sheet for getting the most out of your computing power, right? But let's get into the details. What were some of the specific things they found? Anything that really stood out to you?
One of the coolest things they discovered was that not all the data that gets fed into the LLM's calculations is equally sensitive to this quantization process. They found that if you quantize some inputs, it can really mess up the performance. But for others, it barely makes a difference.
Wait a minute, can we back up for a second?
Yeah.
I think we need to explain what we mean by quantizing these inputs. What's actually happening there?
Sure thing. So inside an LLM, there are all these crazy, complex mathematical operations going on all the time. It's like a giant recipe with a ton of ingredients, right? Those ingredients are the inputs. And when we talk about quantizing those inputs, we're basically simplifying them, using fewer bits to represent them. It's like rounding off the measurements in your recipe instead of using super precise ones.
Okay, that makes sense. So they found that some ingredients are more sensitive to being rounded than others. What does that mean for people who are actually training these models? How should they use this information?
It means you can't just quantize everything willy-nilly and expect it to work perfectly. You've got to be strategic about it. You need to know which parts of the model you can safely simplify without messing things up. For example, they found that if you quantize the input embeddings during the backward pass, that's the part of training where the model is learning from its mistakes, it can really tank the performance.
So it's like some ingredients are absolutely crucial to the recipe, and if you mess with them too much, the whole dish is ruined.
Exactly, you nailed it. That's why it's so important to understand the architecture of these LLMs, the nuts and bolts of how they're put together. And you need to know which inputs are the most sensitive. It's all about finding that balance.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, I'm really curious about this whole idea of an optimal balance between the exponent and mantissa bits. Can you unpack that a little for us?
Remember how we talked about floating point numbers having those two parts? You've got the exponent, which tells you how big the number is, and the mantissa, which gives you the actual digits. Well, it turns out that the perfect ratio between those two parts, it actually changes depending on the overall precision level you're going for. It's like fine-tuning the spices in a recipe. Too much of one and the whole thing is off.
Okay, I'm starting to get a taste for this. But What does all this mean for hardware? Could we actually build processors that are specifically designed to handle this kind of balancing act?
That's exactly where this research could lead. Imagine having processors with special units that are optimized for floating point quantization training. They could adjust the bits for the exponent and mantissa on the fly, depending on the model and data. That would be a huge step forward in terms of efficiency.
Yeah, my mind is officially blown. This is amazing. But before we go any further, let's take a step back and talk about this critical data size thing. What is that exactly, and why should we care?
This is where things get really, really interesting. It kind of flips the script on how we think about training these AI models. For the longest time, the more data, the better, right? Like that was the golden rule. But this research, it's showing us that there's actually a limit, at least when you're using low precision training.
Oh, and you're telling me there's such a thing as 2M must CH data. That doesn't sound right. We always hear about needing these gigantic data sets to train LLMs.
Yeah, it's kind of a shocker, right? But they found that once you hit this critical data size, adding more data, it doesn't actually make the model any better. It can actually make things worse, which is wild.
So it's like there's a point of diminishing returns, kind of like if you overtrain an athlete.
Exactly. You got it. You can push someone too hard, and instead of getting stronger, they get injured. It's the same idea here. At a certain point, more training with low precision, it's not helpful. It's actually harmful.
That's a pretty big deal, especially when you think about all the time and resources that go into collecting and cleaning these massive data sets. I mean, if you don't even need all that data, why bother?
Totally. And here's another thing. This critical data size, it's not a fixed number. It changes depending on how big your model is and what precision level you're using. So for example, if you've got a model with, say, 1 billion parameters, and you're training it with standard precision, that critical data size could be enormous.
Yeah.
But if you train that same model with lower precision, that critical size, it shrinks way down.
So using lower precision, it's like a double win. You need less computing power and less data. That's pretty amazing.
It really is. It changes the game. And for you, it means that understanding this concept, it can save you so much time and hassle. You don't need to go chasing after these giant data sets if they're not actually going to help your model get any better.
Okay, that's a good takeaway. So we've covered a lot of ground here, from floating point numbers to this idea of a critical data size. But let's zoom out a bit. What's the big takeaway? Why does all of this matter?
One of the most important things to remember is this concept of compute optimality. Finding that balance between how much computing power you're using and how accurate you need your model to be. We don't want to just throw more computers at the problem if we can get the same results with less, right?
Right, it's about being efficient, not just brute forcing it.
Exactly. And this research is telling us that for most situations, the smartest approach is probably to use lower precision, somewhere between 4 and 8 bits. And that opens up some really interesting possibilities.
Like what? What could this unlock in the world of LLMs? What's on the horizon?
Well, for one thing, we could start training much bigger models than we can today. Imagine models with trillions of parameters. The things those models could do. They could totally transform fields like natural language processing, even drug discovery, material science, who knows?
That's pretty incredible to think about. But what about for people who are working with LLMs right now? Are there any practical tips they can take away from this research? Anything they can use in their day-to-day work?
One really cool idea from the paper is to use aggressive quantization at the beginning of the training process. Start with a really low precision level and then gradually increase it as you train on more data. It's like starting a fire with a small amount of kindling and slowly adding more wood as it gets going.
So you get the benefit of speed and efficiency early on, and then as you go, you fine-tune it for accuracy.
No, exactly. It's all about finding that sweet spot. And this research, it gives us the blueprint for making those kinds of smart decisions.
This deep dive has been an eye-opener. We've gone from the nuts and bolts of floating point numbers to these big picture questions about the future of AI. It's clear that this research has the potential to change the game.
I know, right? It's been awesome exploring all of this with you. It's always fun to talk about stuff that really makes you think.
And to our listener, a huge thank you for sending us this research. It's folks like you who keep us up to date on all the latest developments in AI. Keep those deep dives coming. And speaking of which, before we wrap up, there's one more thing I wanted to touch on. The paper mentions the possibility of training these massive LLMs with not only lower precision, but also potentially less data. Can you tell us a bit more about that? What kind of impact could that have?
That's where things could get really wild. Imagine if we could get the same results with smaller data sets. It would totally shake things up in the AI world.
Okay, I'm all in. How so?
Well, think about it. Right now, training those top-of-the-line LLMs, it's a huge undertaking. You need mountains of data and tons of computing power. It's really only something big companies and research labs can handle.
It's like an exclusive club for AI, huh?
Pretty much, yeah. But if we can make training more efficient, by using lower precision and maybe even less data, it would open things up. More people could get involved.
So like smaller teams, startups, maybe even just individuals could start messing around with LLMs and see what they could do.
Exactly, that's the dream, right? It would be this huge explosion of creativity. People from all walks of life could bring their ideas to the table. It wouldn't just be limited to a select few.
It almost sounds like what happened with personal computers. Suddenly everyone could have one at home and see what they could create.
It's a good analogy. And just like the PC revolution, this could lead to all sorts of new AI applications, stuff we haven't even thought of yet. Specialized LLMs for every niche. It's crazy exciting to think about.
It is exciting, but there are some things to consider too, right? Like if you give more people access to this kind of powerful technology, how do you make sure they use it responsibly?
That's the big question, isn't it? It's something we really need to be careful about. We need to have clear guidelines, best practices for ethical AI development. We got to make sure people are using this stuff for good.
It's like giving someone a powerful tool. You want to make sure they know how to use it safely and not cause any harm.
Right. It's not just about the technical skills. Developers need to understand the ethical implications too. We need to build AI that benefits everyone.
Well, this deep dive has been quite a journey, from the nitty-gritty of floating point numbers to the big picture of AI in society. It's clear that this research could really shake things up.
Yeah, no doubt. It's been a blast talking about all this with you.
And to our listener, thanks for sharing this research with us. It's listeners like you who keep us on top of all the exciting developments in AI, keep those deep dives coming. And hey, maybe the next one can be about those alternative LLM architectures the paper mentioned. Now there's something to think about. Until next time.